When I was in primary school, we had a thing every morning. We'd have news. You'd come up and you'd tell your news for the day. It was the best part of the day. Sustainable September feels like that. Well, this week's news stories that I've noticed, actually the first one has been playing out over the last couple of weeks, hasn't it? The government is telling us we need more gas. Have you heard that one? We need to kickstart our economy, and we need to spend our way out of the COVID dumps, and we need pipelines of natural gas so that industry can gear back up again. Except, of course, gas is a fossil fuel, isn't it? It produces as much greenhouse gas as the coal that we continue to burn, getting further and further behind the rest of the world who are getting aboard with cheaper, sustainable, renewable energy. And the second story that I noticed this week, I heard this one actually on the radio when I was driving the other day. It was an interview with a Sydney midwife. Babies in Australia are being born now with damaged placentas. Right now in our lucky country, placental damage, premature, underweight and under-oxygenated as a result of air pollution from last summer's apocalyptic bushfires. Temperatures are rising and the land is dry, and we're fast losing the opportunity to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees. And our ruling classes just aren't getting it, because it seems there's still $1 to be made in fossil fuel. Maybe, like me, maybe when you hear stuff like this, you feel concerned but helpless.
Yeah.
What can I possibly do about it? How much do we really need? How much do we really need? And is there a connection between our overconsumption and the needs of others? Jesus seems to think so, doesn't he? For example, with the pointed little story he tells about the man who builds a super barn to store the wheat that his farms have been producing, but loses his life into the bargain. And also with his fiendishly clever little backhander that we blithely call the golden rule, without, it seems to me, ever really thinking through the implications. Do to others, Jesus says to us, do to others what you would have them do for you. Love your neighbour as you love yourself, which neatly exposes the double standards that we live by when we accumulate for ourselves and fail to respond to the needs of others. Well, to be fair, Jesus isn't living in the modern world. The modern world, with its real-world economy of award rates and share markets and economic growth, we've got rules for these sorts of things, haven't we? We've got rules that define our responsibility, for example, to pay tax for social welfare, and rules that encourage us to save for our retirement. Our rights are balanced by our responsibilities. The worker deserves their hire and gives a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Don't fiddle your timesheet. You work the right number of hours, you get the right amount of pay. Or as our Prime Minister puts it, you have a go, you get a go. That way everybody knows where they stand, things are fair, the world is the right way up. As good citizens, we live by these sorts of expectations, don't we? And also as Christians. It seems to me as Christians, we have also internalised the expectations and the standards of the society that we live in. But remember back in chapter 13 of St. Matthew's Gospel, all those parables that we read through a few weeks ago, and how I said that in the stories that Jesus tells, the thing that he seems to most enjoy is taking something that looks like it's the right way up and then deliberately planting it on its head. Likening God's kingdom, for example, to a neighbour or to a farmer deliberately planting weeds, or a worker tricking his neighbour into selling him a paddock with a treasure buried in it. And in today's puzzling story, the story we just heard, in which Jesus tells us basically, hey, in God's scheme of things, your industrial relations laws just don't work. Because God's notions of fairness are not the same as yours. In God's economy, it doesn't matter whether you work all day or whether you turn up at 5 to 5. You'll get a full day's pay all the same. Sounds like God's kingdom really is good news for bludgers and latecomers, eh? Well, the people listening to Jesus' story would have been poor. They would have been dirt poor. Jesus is telling these stories on the back blocks of Galilee, where there's rather a big gap between the haves and the have-nots, way more than there is today. In the first century, maybe 97 or 98% of the population were have-nots, dirt poor, living hand to mouth. Maybe 0.5% had real economic and political power. Maybe, the top 2% at various levels would have had a few acres of their own. But the vast majority of the population were landless peasants. To see poverty and a social structure like that in today's world, you'd need to travel to somewhere like Somalia or Yemen. So if you're one of the elite 2% and you do own a bit of land and you've got a harvest to get in, what you do is you get on your donkey and you go down to the village, and that's where you're going to find all of the local men sitting around under a tree, hoping that somebody is going to hire them today because they've got a wife and 6 kids back home. Maybe they've got a little bit of bread for their breakfast. And if Dad gets some work today, then they'll get something to eat tonight too. And so you hire the youngest ones, don't you? You hire the strongest looking guys, not the ones who look a bit worn out.
Weak.
Absolutely. You hire the strongest ones first. And that's what the farmer in Jesus' story does too. Except that this man keeps going back during the day. And each time he picks up a few more. By the end of the day, maybe he's picking up old grandpas or men on crutches who can't believe their luck. And here's the really silly thing. An hour later, everybody gets just enough to buy food for a family for one day. You see, that's what a denarius was worth. A denarius was the coin that was a daily wage. It was just enough. A family gets to eat for a day on a denarius. It's not enough for superannuation, not enough for saving for a holiday, not enough for buying a donkey cart, but it was enough for bread for one day. It seems that God's idea of justice is just enoughness. Well, it was bound to cause grumbling. And in spite of the farmer's clever words, the ones that worked all day have probably got a point, haven't they? You know what I mean by the work ethic? You probably grew up with it, I did too. It's the voice inside that says if somebody is paying you, you've got to give value for money. There's no such thing as a free ride. And deep down, I guess we're pretty sure that's the way things should be. But Jesus doesn't agree with us. Jesus doesn't think so. Because Jesus is saying to us that in God's scheme of things, there is a deeper level of fairness that our transactional way of thinking just doesn't get. Well, the reading this morning from the Old Testament, from the book of Exodus, makes actually exactly the same point. The Israelites are on the run out of Egypt. They've left behind everything that's familiar and safe. And, well, even if they were slaves back in Egypt, at least they had something in their tummies. And so now they are hungry. They're scared and they're cranky. It's all Moses' fault. It's all God's fault. And God gives them what they need. What they need is bread. What they need is just enough bread for today. And that is what God gives them. What they want, of course, is another thing. God gives them just what they need. Enough for today. And if you read a bit further in this passage from Exodus, you'll find out that if you try to save any for the next day, it goes off. So the difference between us and God, we're focused on what we want. And we're also focused on what we think we deserve. Give me what I deserve, or maybe I should rephrase that. I'll tell you what I deserve, just give me that. God doesn't give them what they want, only what they need. Why is that? Why? Because in God's economy, in God's scheme of things, what human beings are created to want is God. What human beings are created to rely on is God. Stashing a few kilos of manna behind the hump of your camel for tomorrow, that means not being quite convinced that God's promises are reliable. That's the point. God doesn't give me what I deserve. Actually, just as well, really. God gives me what I need. And that's why it is in the prayer that Jesus teaches us. It's there, isn't it? Word for word. Give us today the bread we need for today, our daily bread. Yes, but let's be honest, there are quite a few people not getting that, aren't there? Even just what they need for today. You see, even when we do adjust our way of thinking and work out the difference between our wants and our needs, in the real world, it's not working out the way Jesus says. God's scheme of things isn't the way it's working out in the world that we live in and the world that our human priorities have created. So there's a basic contradiction and a basic problem. What the heck are we going to do with that? Well, we're still in Sustainable September, aren't we? And so we're reflecting this month on the earth and its living systems and how the way that we live affects God's creation. And as we know, the crisis of climate change is also a crisis of enoughness. Because the economics of growth and prosperity mean that we actually are taking more from the earth than it can produce. Economists and climate ecologists as well tell us that actually we are taking year by year about 1.5 times as much as the earth can produce in a single year in terms of the impact we have on the living systems of soil and water and air and forest and oceans. And that means we're stealing from the future. We're stealing from the future of our planet. We're stealing from the future of tomorrow's human beings. We're stealing from our own children and grandchildren who will not have the bread that they need tomorrow if we take it and squander it today. You know, the science of climate change is settled. If I take an apple and I let it go, it's going to go that way, isn't it? That's the science of gravity, and it's as settled. And the science of climate change is as settled as that. And so is the economics. The bread that other people need for today and the room to heal and flourish that our earth and all of its living systems need, that is denied when we take more than we need and refuse to listen to the voices urging us to respect our natural limits. So to return to the question I asked, what the heck can I do about it? What the heck can we do about it as Christians? And I think quite a lot. Quite a lot. As Christians, for a start, we can love what God loves. We can learn to do that. We can gossip the goodness of God's good earth. We can learn to practice an ethic of care for creation, and we can model a spirituality that is in tune with God's creation, a spirituality that literally is grounded, a spirituality that notices the needs of others and that also learns to widen its circle of compassion to include the whole of God's creation. And so the message for today is that we need a spirituality of just enoughness, a spirituality that reconnects our desires with our true needs and with the needs of the earth, a spirituality that reconnects us with our true context and our true home.
We'll all be right, mate.
Amen. We'll be right, mate, maybe, if we practice a spirituality of just enoughness. Amen.